Welcome to the third part of our UX design series. In this one we're going to have a look at the process of reading and how we can help facilitate this process within the apps, the applications that we design and develop. By way of a bit of context, and this sort of really underpins the need why we need to make reading as efficient and as easy as possible. There's a bold claim here, and we'll elaborate on this in the next slide, that reading is unnatural. Fundamentally, this is actually true, and it's one of the things that we, as a consequence of it being unnatural, we'll say what it means by unnatural in a second. It means that it's something we need to work quite hard at within our apps and our applications to make it as effortless as possible to the user. Now, when we say it's unnatural, this is not to say it's impossible, but what it is to say is that it requires some degree of conscious effort to read. There are a number of mental activities that we generally find, or we classify as effortless. Now, it does obviously require effort, but not necessarily conscious effort or a lot of effort on our behalf. So things like speech and understanding spoken language, these are things that we have, if you like, an innate ability. Our biological systems, our brain it develops in a way that almost is given or expects to develop speech. There's specific regions within the brain that are designed to do this and actually help us do that. So people, when they're growing up, can effortlessly learn speech, to produce sounds, to understand spoken sounds. The same isn't true of reading and counterpart writing. And if you think about the grand scale of things out of the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years that, in terms of our evolution, that people have gone through, it's only relatively recent that reading and writing has become common. Common in the sense that, certainly in Western countries, the majority of people get exposure or have a good experience of doing that. Certainly, yes, books have been about for a number of centuries, but centuries are you don't come back that far given the thousands of years through which we have evolved. And even within this context, they would not have been widely shared. And the privilege of being able to write, again, is only recently, within the last few hundred odd years, that has been something that is widespread in terms of its adoption. So reading and writing, reasonably recent, if you like, introductions in terms of the grand scale. How do we learn them? Now, this contrasts quite sharply with spoken speech, which we can pick up really effortlessly. For reading, for writing, it requires a lot of instruction, a lot of repeated practice, to the point where a lot of primary education is actually concerned with developing those core skills. How this impacts on us as all sort of accomplished readers and writers, it does have an impact in the sense that if we are reading something, it requires a degree of conscious effort. We have to be focused on the task. Whereas for speech, very often people can be talking in the background, we can understand them, we can be doing other things alongside this. The understanding of speech requires considerably less cognitive effort than it does for reading. That has implications, because if we are creating an application within which the user has to read information, then we want to try to make sure that it is as easy as possible to extract the information that we want to provide in our applications. How this relates then? So for the majority of websites, or for the majority of applications, not all, but the majority, we generally don't read them in the sense that you sort of read a book starting from the beginning going through to the end. We scan them. There may be a bunch of written information on the screen structured in a certain way. We generally scan that information to decide if it's useful or to look for something that we are looking for. Words, phrases, anything that catches the eyes, these generally are the trigger points. Now, why do we do that? The side at the bottom comes in that we don't do this in all cases. So, for example, for a news story, you may end up reading that full story. Though quite often, actually, people may still skip over bits if they don't think it's particularly relevant. For things like, actually, written stories, novels, there the whole notion is that the sequence of words helps establish and build up and to construct something within the reader's mind. So in that sense, actually, we generally will read every single word. But for websites, for applications, for apps, so the types of things that we're developing that people will be using, the users know that they don't need to read everything. They're maybe only interested in doing something, so they just need to read things that are specific to that something. Now, either we're lazy or we're optimally efficient, but again, as an inclination, we'll not read more or scan more than we need to. So it is how we process a lot of written information within applications. It is through scanning. So we want to make sure that within our apps we have created, structured, laid out the information in a manner that actually helps the user best scan and find and access and understand the information that's been presented. Now, in the previous lectures, we had a look at structure and how we can structure things by way of visual hierarchy to help the scanning process. If we're looking specifically here at written information, there's a number of things we can do that actually helps the reader understand written text. We're going to look at a number of them. The first one is using an appropriate typeface or a font. You can see there's 4 examples on the right-hand side of the screen. In each case, the information contained within the paragraph or the sentence is exactly the same. They just differ based on the font. And if you were to go through these, you'll find that there are some fonts that are more easily read. And this ties into part of how we learn to read is looking at letter groupings and grouping sequence of letters into a coherent unit, into a word that we can then turn into sound and understand from that. So the typeface, the font, depending on how it's set out, it will help us or either hinder us with that process of grouping. So ideally we want a font that we can look at and very easily group the letters into words and then from that understand what those units are. One at the bottom, this is particularly difficult because if you were to scan that simply, it's not necessarily that easy to be able to group them into chunks or to understand what are the letters within each of the chunks. Whereas the one at the top, that actually is quite an easy one to group and to understand. Related to that one is the background. So again, we're still talking about the process of people being able to scan a chunk of text and to understand it as a number of different words to do that grouping. So if we have our text on a noisy background, one that doesn't have a high level of contrast with the foreground text, that is also something that will disrupt the process of reading. Doesn't necessarily make it impossible, but it means that we have to slow down the rate at which we can read and scan this information. It requires more conscious effort on behalf of the user, and these are generally things that we don't want to do that makes it more difficult then to access that information. How we lay out and align the text also comes into this as well. Generally when we're reading something, certainly in the Western countries, we sort of read from left to right and then jump back. So we are used to reading left to right, getting to the end, and our eyes automatically flick back to more or less where they started and a little bit down. So if you have a text that is aligned to the left, or fully justified, either one, that supports this scanning notion of getting to the end and jumping back to a consistent point. If you have text that's right aligned, for us in the West, that's more difficult to scan, or text that is centered again, it is generally more difficult to scan. By way of a series of useful hints and tips about how we can make it as easy as possible for the user to read text. We're going to go through a few of them here. So a few of them we've pretty sort of looked at. Obviously, use an easily readable font, and there are many fonts, and including some quite decorative fonts, that still enable you to easily group and to chunk that information together. So easily readable font, key component of it. Clear and consistent text layout. Now that applies to the alignment of the text, it applies to how we structure it on the screen in terms of a visual hierarchy. So again, understandable. New one here, use plain language. Within a lot of our application or apps, we're trying to present information to the user. So in this sense, we want to use language that clearly gets across what it is, the message that we are trying to communicate. We don't want to use flowery, complex, sort of obtuse or not familiar terms. Using a consistent vocabulary also helps. So if we refer to something in a particular way in one particular part of our applications, referring it to it in the same way in another one will help the user by way of, again, scanning and understanding the context and what is meant. Other related and sort of aspects to this, omit needless words. So I mean, a sentence should contain no unnecessary words, a paragraph no unnecessary sentences. And most of the ones on this screen is all about reducing the number of words that you actually provide on screen to the user. If you reduce the number of words, again, you're providing fewer words, the user then has less words to scan and to understand. So there's a number of different ways you can do this. Obviously, omitting needless words, words that if you were to take out wouldn't change the meaning of the thing that is being read. If that's the case, remove the word because you can get the same meaning but with fewer words. Second one, get rid of happy talk. This actually is quite a sensible one to include. You might go along to some page that'll have a few paragraphs at the start that says, "Oh, welcome to this page. You know, we're going to talk about this, we're going to talk about that," or whatever. Generally, 99% of cases, you don't need it. Get rid of the thing. It's stuff that the user will scan over and dismiss as not being relevant. They don't need to be welcome to the page because they went to the page, or they don't need to be welcome to whatever bit of your application because that's where they went to, that's where they want, presumably, to be. Minimize instructions. Everything should be self-explanatory. Ideally, that's one of the key purposes of, say, UX design process. If you really need it, be brief and to the point. So if you have designed your application, and you should, to try to make it obvious and to have a lot of structural information that helps the user step through whatever it is they're trying to achieve, you don't need instructions. If you have something that is horrendously complicated to use to the point where you have to include written instructions, your first thought there should be, well, does it have to be this way? How can I actually improve this process? And if it absolutely must be this way, for whatever reason, then make sure that your instructions, again, omitting these words, are as brief or as concise as they can be, sufficient to enable the user to be able to use it. Takeaways on this one, 3 of them here, but they're all sort of reasonable, sensible ones. Reading requires effort. It requires more conscious effort than listening does. Because it requires effort, and we want to make our applications easy for the user to use, effortless is another way of saying that, we want to make sure that whatever reading is involved in accessing our applications is as straightforward, streamlined, easy to do as possible. Various ways we can do that. We can make sure the text is easily read in terms of the font, the typeface we're using, the background, the layout, how we've sort of set it out on the screen. We should also make sure that, other than being easily read, what it is the user is reading is to the point, is concise, it gets across the essential information, doesn't contain waffle or other things that distract from that. And if you adhere to these 2 reasonably straightforward and simple setups, you can then make sure the applications in your apps are designed in a way that, at least in terms of the reading component, the user will find them as sort of effortless and easy to access.